just relive it. He relive it every year.
Reliving his sister's murder since 1978. 20-year-old Katie Maggiore and her husband Brian were shot to death while out on a walk in their suburban Rancho Cordova neighborhood.
She squatted down and he shot her twice in the top of the head.
But
There is a
Keith Smith
photograph taken in 1979 in the pages of a small California newspaper. It shows a police officer, clean-cut, unremarkable, smiling as he promotes a youth baseball fundraiser. A man who had sworn an oath to protect and serve. A man whose neighbors would one day describe as an oddball, a loner, but never, not once, as a monster. And in the very years that photograph was being taken, investigators would later allege that same officer was slipping through darkened windows across the state of California, binding couples in their beds and leaving behind a trail of terror that would go unsolved for more than 4 decades. He was one of the most hunted men in American history. He had more than a dozen names given to him by frightened communities and baffled detectives. The Visalia ransacker, the East Area rapist, the original Night Stalker. Thousands of tips, task forces, composite sketches taped to bedroom walls across 10 counties. And through all of it, he was never so much as a suspect. Not until a distant relative, someone who had never met him, someone who may not have even known his name, did something entirely ordinary. By the end of this, you'll understand exactly how a stranger's spit in a plastic tube ended the longest manhunt in California history. But first, you have to understand who was taken. Katie Maggiore was 20 years old. Her husband Brian was 21, a young serviceman stationed at Mather Air Force Base east of Sacramento. They had been married less than 2 years. Friends who grew up with them remembered a couple who came from good families, who were kind, who were easy to love. A couple who talked about traveling the world someday and starting a family of their own. On the evening of February 2nd, 1978, they were doing the most ordinary thing 2 young people in love could do. They were walking their dog through their quiet Rancho Cordova neighborhood. Somewhere in the dark, they crossed paths with a prowler. Witnesses would later say the couple was seen running. Investigators believe Brian and Katie tried to flee, that they were chased down through a neighbor's backyard, and that they were shot to death there in the grass. A young husband and wife cut down on an evening stroll for reasons detectives to this day cannot fully explain. Some who studied the case would come to believe the most haunting theory of all, that the Maggiores died simply because they saw his face, because they might have been able to identify him. And here is the detail that wouldn't matter for 30 years. This killing didn't fit. It was outside everything investigators thought they knew about the man terrorizing Sacramento. He came into homes, he didn't shoot people on the street. It was so different that for a long time, no one was even certain it belonged to him at all. That question, whether these 2 murders were connected to the larger nightmare, would sit unanswered for decades. Remember that. Remember the young couple walking their dog and the crime that didn't fit the pattern. Because in the end, it would help close the whole case. Katie's brother, Keith, would relive his sister's murder every year for 4 decades. He would tell reporters that, after so long, you start to make a kind of terrible peace with it. You start to assume the man who did it is probably dead, that the answer would never come. For the Maggiore family, and for so many families after them, the waiting had only just begun. To understand the scale of what was coming, you have to go back further, to a farming town called Visalia, about 40 miles south of Fresno. Beginning around 1974, that community was gripped by a bizarre and unnerving crime wave. A burglar was breaking into more than 100 homes. But he wasn't just stealing. He was ransacking, tearing through drawers, taking small and strange trophies, single earrings, loose coins, family photographs. He was leaving a signature of chaos that felt less like theft and more like violation. Then, in September of 1975, it turned to murder. A journalism professor named Claude Snelling woke in the night to find an intruder trying to abduct his teenage daughter from their home. Snelling confronted him. The intruder shot him twice and vanished into the dark, and Claude Snelling died protecting his child. The town of Visalia braced for more. And then, abruptly, the ransacking stopped. They stopped because the man authorities would come to suspect had moved on. He'd taken a new job, in a different town, in law enforcement. By the summer of 1976, a new terror had migrated north to the eastern suburbs of Sacramento. It began the way these things so often do, with a prowler, a peeping figure at windows, a shadow in backyards. And then, on a June night in 1976, It escalated into rape when a man broke into the home of a woman in Rancho Cordova and attacked her at knife point. He would go on to assault dozens of women across the region. The papers gave him a name that would come to haunt the entire area, the East Area Rapist. His method was deliberate, patient, and cruel. According to the FBI, he would pry open a window or a door while his victims slept. He would move through the house in the dark. When he attacked couples, investigators say he would bind both of them, separate them, and place dishes on the back of the bound man, telling him that if he heard those dishes rattle, his wife would die. Survivors described a masked figure who spoke through clenched teeth in a forced, guttural whisper. He seemed to know things, where they lived, when they'd be alone, the layout of their homes. He seemed, chillingly, to have been watching for a long time. And then he did something almost no serial predator does. He evolved. He moved. The attacks spread south and west, Modesto, Stockton, Davis, into the Bay Area communities of Danville and Fremont, and the rapes began turning into something worse. On the night of December 30th, 1979, in the coastal community of Goleta near Santa Barbara, Dr. Robert Offerman, 44, and Deborah Manning, 35, were murdered in their home. It was the first of a string of killings that would ripple down the California coast. 3 months later, in March of 1980, the violence reached a quiet Ventura County home. Lyman Smith was 43, a respected attorney who was on the short list to be appointed to the Superior Court bench. He had served on the governor's traffic safety board and had even helped write the California law requiring children to be placed in safety seats. His brother would remember him simply as a man who always put others first, who always looked out for kids. His wife Charlene was 33, an interior decorator who ran a small jewelry business. In the middle of the night, someone broke in. According to prosecutors, both were bound. Charlene was sexually assaulted, and the couple was bludgeoned to death with a log taken from their own woodpile outside. They were found by Lyman's 12-year-old son. The killing didn't stop. That August, Keith and Patrice Harrington were murdered in their home in Dana Point. The following year, in July of 1981, a realtor walked into a Santa Barbara County home and discovered Cherry Domingo and her boyfriend Greg Sanchez, both bound and killed. And then, in 1986, in Irvine, an 18-year-old named Janelle Cruz was raped and murdered in her family's home. She is believed to have been his last victim. After Janelle Cruz, the attacks simply stopped, and a killer who had terrorized 10 counties for more than a decade vanished into thin air. Here is the cruelest part of this story. For years, the police didn't even know they were chasing one man. The crimes were scattered across the entire state. Different counties, different jurisdictions, different detectives who often didn't talk to one another. To the investigators in Sacramento, he was the East Area Rapist. To detectives working the coastal murders in Southern California, he was a different phantom entirely, the original Night Stalker. Some jurisdictions insisted the crimes were connected, others flatly disagreed. The killer had, in effect, hidden inside the gaps between police departments. He had used the very structure of law enforcement against itself, and investigators would come to believe that was no accident, because the man they were hunting had been trained by them. The tips poured in, thousands of them over the years. Detectives chased suspect after suspect. They built profiles. They circulated sketches of a young white male, roughly 5'9". They followed leads to dead ends, again and again, and watched each promising thread dissolve into nothing. Men were investigated, cleared, and set aside. The composite drawings yellowed on office walls. Detectives retired with the case still open, handing the files to the next generation like an inheritance no one wanted. There was one man who might have fit. An ordinary police officer who'd worked in the small town of Exeter, near Visalia, right when the ransackings were happening, and then moved to the Auburn Police Department outside Sacramento, right as the East Area Rapist emerged. He'd even been fired from that department in 1979, authorities said, caught shoplifting a can of dog repellent and a hammer from a drugstore. But no one connected those dots. Why would they? He was one of thousands. His name never surfaced. He blended into the very communities he is accused of hunting, an unremarkable figure living an unremarkable life in a suburban Sacramento home. The trouble was that even when investigators finally had genetic evidence, even after DNA in the early 2000s definitively linked the Northern California rapes to the Southern California murders and proved it had been one man all along, they still had nothing to match it to. His DNA wasn't in any criminal database. He had never been convicted of a violent felony. You can have a killer's exact genetic fingerprint and still have absolutely no way to attach a name to it. The evidence was screaming. There was simply no one to point at. The case went quiet. The tool that would finally solve it hadn't been invented yet. So let me introduce you to that tool, because it works in a way that feels almost like magic, and it's simpler than you might think. For decades, DNA matching worked like a lock and key. You had a genetic sample from a crime scene, and you compared it against a database of known criminals, looking for one exact match. If the killer wasn't already in that database, you had nothing. The lock had no key, and this killer had made sure his key was never on file. But around 2018, investigators tried something completely different. Instead of asking, does this DNA match a known criminal? They asked a far more powerful question, does this DNA match anyone's relatives? Here's why that changes everything. Millions of ordinary people had begun sending their saliva to consumer genealogy companies, spitting into tubes to learn about their ancestry, to find long-lost cousins, to build family trees. Some of them uploaded their genetic profiles to a public database where anyone could search for matches. And the crucial insight was this: the killer's DNA didn't have to match the killer at all. It only had to partially match a cousin, a second cousin, a third or fourth cousin, someone who shared just a sliver of the same ancestry, someone who might live across the country and had no idea a murderer sat somewhere on their family tree, because your DNA is a map of everyone you're related to. You share about half your genetic markers with a parent, a quarter with a grandparent, smaller and smaller fractions with more distant relatives. And that means a distant cousin's DNA contains faint, unmistakable echoes of your own. Investigators took the killer's decades-old genetic profile. And to do this, they needed a pristine sample, which they had thanks to a forward-thinking pathologist who had carefully preserved and frozen evidence from one of the crimes back in 1980. And they uploaded it to that public genealogy database. And it worked. They didn't find the killer. They found his distant relatives, third or fourth cousins, scattered across the country who had innocently uploaded their DNA to find family. Now, the real work began. A team of genealogists took those distant matches and began building family trees. Enormous, sprawling trees reaching back through generations, tracing marriages and births and deaths, searching for the single point where all these different family lines crossed. It took months. They were reverse engineering, a killer from the shape of his own family. And slowly, the branches began narrowing toward one name. As the family tree tightened, investigators started applying everything the original detectives had learned over 40 years. They cross-referenced the genealogy against age. The killer would now be in his 70s. Against geography, he had to have lived in the right places at the right times. Against the old profile, the physical description survivors had given, right down to build and height. Branch by branch, they eliminated the people who couldn't be him until the enormous tree had been pruned down to a single terrifying possibility. One man, a former police officer, now in his 70s, living quietly in a Citrus Heights home just 16 miles from where the first Sacramento murders had taken place, and not far, it turned out, from where his crimes may have begun. But a family tree is not proof. A genealogical match points you at a person. It doesn't convict them. Investigators needed his actual DNA, a direct sample from this specific man, to compare against the evidence they'd guarded for 40 years. And they couldn't simply ask him for it, not without tipping him off, not without risking that a man who had evaded them for 4 decades might run. So they did what he had done to so many others. They watched him. They set up surveillance in his quiet neighborhood, and they waited for him to discard something of himself. They collected what authorities described only as discarded DNA. Genetic material he threw away without a thought, reportedly including a tissue left in the trash. They took that sample back to the lab, and they compared it to the evidence. Now, remember the young couple walking their dog? Remember the murder that didn't fit, the one investigators weren't even sure belonged to the case? The Sacramento County District Attorney would later say that the answer was always going to be in the DNA, and that one of the confirming connections, one of the final links that tied this man to the whole sprawling nightmare, came through the killing of Brian and Katie Maggiore. The crime that had puzzled everyone for 40 years. The loose thread that wouldn't matter for 3 decades. It mattered now. The discarded DNA matched. And the manhunt that had spanned a lifetime came down to a single name. On April 24, 2018, sheriff's deputies moved in on the home in Citrus Heights. The man they'd been hunting for 40 years walked out of his own front door and was placed in handcuffs, reportedly telling the arresting deputies, almost absurdly, that he had a roast in the oven. His name was Joseph James DeAngelo. He was 72 years old. And here is the irony that investigators had spent decades unknowingly circling. The man accused of being the Golden State Killer had been a police officer. He had worn the badge in Exeter from 1973 to 1976, precisely when authorities now believed the Visalia ransacker was terrorizing that region. He had served in Auburn from 1976 to 1979, precisely as the East Area rapist emerged in Sacramento. He had been trained in exactly how crimes are investigated, how evidence is gathered, how suspects are caught. And prosecutors believe he used that training to become nearly uncatchable, to know what not to leave behind, to slip through the seams between jurisdictions that never compared notes. The hunter had been one of the hunters. That's why his name never surfaced. That newspaper photo of the smiling officer at the baseball fundraiser was taken in the same era he is alleged to have been committing these crimes. He was never on the radar. His former police chief, the man who once fired him for shoplifting, would say there had been nothing about him that suggested a monster. He was, as one neighbor put it, just the person next door. In June of 2020, Joseph James DeAngelo pleaded guilty to 13 counts of first-degree murder. As part of the plea deal, he was required to admit to dozens of additional crimes. The rapes for which the statute of limitations had long since expired, described in unflinching detail by prosecutors in a courtroom full of the people whose lives he had shattered. The death penalty was taken off the table. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. For 3 days that August, in a makeshift courtroom, the survivors came. One after another, women who had lived for 40 years in the shadow of a masked stranger stood and looked at the frail old man in the wheelchair, and they spoke. They told stories of terror, but also of endurance, of the lives they had gone on to build, the families they had raised, the fear they had refused to let define them. One survivor's words captured what that room meant to so many. This was not their secret anymore. The families of the dead spoke too, the daughter of Lyman and Charlene Smith, the brother of Katie Maggiore, who had spent 4 decades assuming this day would never come. For them, there was no undoing what was done. There was only, at long last, a name, a face, an end to the not knowing. Joseph DeAngelo's arrest changed the landscape of criminal justice. He became the first suspect ever publicly identified and arrested through investigative genetic genealogy. And in the years since, that same technique has been used to identify more than 150 other suspects in cases that everyone had long since given up on. Cases exactly like this one. Cold cases, some of them older than the detectives now working them, where the evidence sat in a freezer for decades waiting for a science that hadn't been born yet. And that is the quiet promise this case leaves behind. Somewhere right now, there is another killer who thinks he got away with it. Another family who long ago stopped expecting the phone to ring. Another sealed box of evidence in another storage room, and a genetic thread, faint as an echo, waiting for the right person to spit into a tube and never suspect what they've set in motion. Because, as this case proved, the past is patient, and it is no longer silent.